the backyard hummed with the hollow cheer of a celebration I had built. On my brother's engagement day, his father threw a filthy rag at me and told me to hide my face. My brother and mother laughed with the guests. I stayed silent. They thought I would endure it again. Until that moment changed everything. The grease on the fabric smelled of old rot and forgotten chores. I did not drop the stack of plates. I simply stood still as the ladder turned into a jagged, rhythmic pulse. I looked at David, the golden groom, whose teeth flashed white under the string lights. He reached out to adjust his silk tie, his hands clean, because mine were stained. Our mother stood beside him, her fingers resting on his sleeve like he was a fragile saint. She did not look at the rag on the grass. She did not see the black streak across my cheek, though her eyes held a sharp, calculating glint. Instead, she leaned in to whisper a joke to a wealthy neighbor. The neighbor nodded while stepping over my shadow. The guests began to drift toward the long tables I had hauled from the garage alone. I watched my father, Elias, command the center of the lawn with a heavy glass of scotch. He paced like a king surveying a conquered territory. Every time his eyes passed over me, his lip curled in a silent, practiced dismissal. I was the furniture that bled, the engine they never bothered to oil. I felt the cold weight of the bank statements in my blazer pocket. They were heavy and sharp. Aunt Denise approached me with a tight, pained smile that never reached her eyes. She reached out to brush a stray leaf from my shoulder, as if I were a messy statue. She told me to be the bigger person for the sake of the family name. Her voice was a low hiss, urgent and thin. I did not blink or offer the expected nod of agreement. I simply watched a bead of sweat roll down her powdered neck. She pulled her hand away, as if my skin had burned her. The formal toast began as the sun dipped below the jagged hedge line. Elias tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass, demanding a silence he did not deserve. He spoke of legacy and the pride of a father who builds a future for his sons. He looked at David with a warmth that felt like a physical blow to my chest. I stepped forward, moving out of the dim periphery and into the golden glow of the main stage. The guests shifted, their whispers dying in the grass. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded ledger of their secret debts. The paper crinkled, sounding like a small fire in the sudden stillness of the yard. I did not look for permission or wait for a cue. I walked to the head table and slapped the filthy rag onto the white linen cloth. My mother's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. I met my father's gaze and felt the lie finally break. He reached for the rag, but his hand began to shake. The silence in the yard felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Elias stared at the greasy rag on the table, as if it were a venomous snake. His face flushed a deep, mottled purple while the guests looked away in embarrassment. I stood my ground, my fingers still tracing the sharp edges of the bank records in my palm. The light from the string bulbs caught the ink on the ledger. David shifted beside our mother, his confidence visibly draining away. "What is this nonsense, Joel?" my father hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. He tried to shove the rag aside with his sleeve, but the grace left a dark smear on the white cloth. I did not move or lower my head. Instead, I pointed to the first line on the printed statement. It showed a payment for David's overdue mortgage from last winter. The guests leaned in, their curiosity outweighing their loyalty to the patriarch. A new murmur began. David stepped forward, trying to laugh it off with a hollow, shaking sound. He reached for the paper, but I pulled it back just out of his reach. He looked at the crowd, pleading for someone to join his mockery. No one did. They were too busy staring at the numbers on the page. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settling in my chest. This was the moment the golden child finally lost his luster. The truth was out. I spent years paying for your mistakes, I said, my voice steady and low. The guests shifted, their whispers growing into a dull roar of realization. My mother finally looked at me, but there was no pride in her eyes. There was only the terror of a woman seeing her favorite son's mask slip. She reached out to touch David's arm, but he pulled away. He looked at our father, waiting for a command that would never come. Elias slammed his glass down on the wooden table, the crystal cracking under the force. He looked around the yard, searching for a way to rewrite the scene in his favor. He claimed I was lying, but his eyes were darting toward the exit. I turned the page to show the venue deposit, signed in my name. The crowd gasped as the math became undeniable. Slept. I was the one who had funded this entire engagement party. I owned the night. The neighbors began to whisper about the debts and the hidden bank accounts. I saw Aunt Denise backing away into the shadows of the porch. She did not want to be near the collapse of the family empire. I realized that my silence had been the only thing holding their reputations together. Now that I had spoken, the structure was turning to dust. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. I felt the weight of the world finally shifting off me. David tried to grab my collar, but I stepped aside with a calm, practiced grace. He stumbled into the table, knocking over a tray of expensive appetizers. The guests watched him fall with a mix of pity and disgust. He looked up at me from the grass, his face a mask of pure, childish shock. My father tried to speak, but he had no words left. I realized then I had forgotten to bring the final set of keys. David scrambled up from the wet grass, his hands shaking with humiliated fury. He reached for a heavy glass bottle on the buffet, but Elias caught his wrist. The guests were frozen, a circle of statues under the humming yellow lights. I felt the cold air biting at my damp neck. My objective was simple now. I needed to hand over the physical keys to the house David claimed was his own. He was living in my shadow. "Give me those papers, Joel," my father commanded, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He tried to physically block my path to the microphone. The pressure in the yard was a physical weight against my chest. I sidestepped him, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The guests watched every movement with wide, unblinking eyes. I reached into my inner pocket and felt the cold brass of the spare keys. The crowd murmured as the metal clinked. I stepped toward David and held the keys out in the dim light. He stared at them as if they were made of burning coal. These keys belonged to the property title I had quietly secured last year. He had told everyone he bought the place with his own hard work. The truth was a sharp blade between us now. I saw his fiancée backing away toward the porch. Her face was a mask of sudden, dawning horror. "This is my house, David," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air. The guests gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind through dead leaves. David looked at our mother, but she was staring at the ground. She knew the secret had finally been dragged into the light. Elias tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away. He looked smaller now, a man losing his grip on a lie. He was failing. The balance had shifted entirely toward the man they once mocked. I looked at the rag, sitting on the white linen, a stain on their perfect evening. It represented every insult and every hour of unseen labor. David's hand brushed against the keys, but he did not take them. He was paralyzed of the eyes of the neighborhood. I felt no joy in this moment. I only felt a strange, hollow sense of finality. I turned to the guests and told them the party was over. No one argued or tried to defend the host. They began to move toward the gate in a slow, awkward procession. My father stood by the cracked table, his shoulders slumped and his pride gone. He looked at the rag and then at me. I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. I reached down, snatched the filthy rag from the table, and shoved it into my pocket. He realized he could no longer control my silence. It was truly finished. I walked toward the driveway without looking back at the wreckage. My car sat under the oak tree, a dark shape against the night. I felt the weight of the bank records still in my blazer. I had reclaimed my name, but the cost was the only family I had. As I reached for the door, I saw a black sedan idling at the curb. A stranger was watching me from behind the wheel. He held a camera. The camera lens glinted under the streetlights like a predatory eye. I paused with my hand on the car door, the engine of the black sedan purring with a low, metallic threat. The photographer did not look away when I met his gaze. He lowered the device, his face obscured by the deep shadows of the cabin. My primary objective was to leave this property before Elias found his second wind. I felt the sharp adrenaline fading fast. I heard the gravel crunch behind me. My father was not done with his performance. He marched down the driveway, his chest heaving under his sweat-stained shirt. He ignored the stranger in the car and focused entirely on the papers in my hand. The pressure of his presence was a physical heat. He grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle with desperate strength. I looked at his hand, and then directly into his bloodshot, panicked eyes. "Give me those records, Joel," he demanded, his voice cracking like dry wood. He looked at the sedan and realized the humiliation was being recorded for a wider audience. I pulled away from his grip, my movement sharp and final. The power balance shifted as I realized he was no longer protecting the family. He was protecting a business loan I had secretly co-signed. If the bank saw this footage, his credit would vanish by morning. I leaned close to his ear, so the stranger could not hear our words. I told him the loan was already flagged for review. His face went pale, the color of curdled milk. He took a step back, his hands falling limp to his sides. The guests had all vanished, leaving only the three of us in the cold night air. The hum of the idling car grew louder between us. I had the only leverage left. The photographer opened his door and stepped out onto the asphalt. He was a young man in a cheap suit, looking more like a lawyer than a journalist. He held out a business card that felt heavy and expensive. He told me he was looking for the man who owned the deed to the property. David's name was not on his list. I took the card and felt the texture of the embossed gold lettering. He was a process server. I looked back at the house, where David was sitting on the porch steps. He looked like a broken toy discarded in the dark. The house was not just a home. It was a primary asset in a lawsuit I had ignored for months. My father realized the truth at the same instant I did. We were both standing in the middle of a collapsing fraud. The rag on the table was the least of our problems now. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the door with a loud click. The process server turned his attention to my father, who was still frozen on the grass. I started the engine, the vibration of the car masking the sound of Elias shouting my name. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. The road ahead was black and empty. I noticed a small red light blinking on my dashboard. The blinking red light on my dashboard signaled a door was not fully latched. I braked hard, the tires screaming against the dry asphalt. My objective was to secure the car and disappear into the night. I leaned over the seat, but the rear door swung wide open before I could reach it. David was there, his face contorted with a desperate, frantic energy. He lunged into the cabin, his fingers clawing at the leather headrest. He was terrified. "You cannot just leave us with this mess, Joel," David yelled, his voice cracking. He tried to grab the steering wheel, but I shoved him back with a firm, steady arm. The pressure was mounting as the process server approached the vehicle with a calm, predatory stride. I felt the vibration of the engine beneath my boots. David was panting, the smell of cheap champagne and sweat filling the small space. He looked like a cornered, frantic animal. The process server tapped on my window with the edge of a thick, manila envelope. I rolled the glass down, just an inch to hear his message. He told me that the lawsuit involved a forged signature on the deed. I looked at David, whose eyes suddenly darted away toward the dark trees. The power balance shifted as the weight of the crime became clear. My brother had not just been lazy. He had been a common thief. I shifted the car into drive, my heart hammering against my ribs. David began to plead, his words a messy blur of excuses and half-truths. He admitted to using my old work ID to access the bank records. I felt a cold, sharp anger replace the hollow exhaustion. He had risked my entire career to fund his fake lifestyle. The realization hit me like a physical punch. I had protected a monster while he sharpened his teeth. "Get out of my car, David," I said, my voice like a serrated blade. He froze, realizing I was no longer the soft target he had bullied for years. He saw the red light reflecting in my eyes and finally understood. I was done being his safety net. I was done being the family joke. He scrambled out of the seat, his expensive shoes slipping on the gravel. He hit the ground hard and stayed there shaking. I pulled the door shut and heard the lock engage with a heavy, final thud. The process server was handing the envelope to my father near the oak tree. Elias was screaming at the sky, his hands tearing at his hair in the moonlight. I looked at the manila packet and realized my own name was printed on the front. I was not just a witness. I was the primary defendant in the fraud case. I pressed the gas pedal and felt the car surge forward into the blackness. The blinking red light finally went out as the speed increased. I checked the rearview mirror one last time. The house was a small, glowing island of misery in a sea of shadows. I reached into the glove box and found a burner phone I had hidden months ago. It was already vibrating with a text from an unknown number. My bank account was empty, drained by the very signatures David had forged. The digital zero on my banking app stared back like a cold, hollow eye. I pulled onto a dark shoulder under a rusted overpass to stop the car. My objective was to find where the money had gone before the fraud charges locked me in a cage. The burner phone buzzed again in my trembling hand. A single text message contained a blurry photo of my own signature on a document I had never seen. My stomach turned with a sharp, sickening lurch. I pounded the steering wheel until my knuckles bled against the hard plastic rim. The pressure was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs in the cramped cabin. David had not just stolen my identity. He had methodically dismantled my entire future, while I was busy serving him drinks. I realized every cent I earned had been diverted into a hidden shell company. The betrayal was deep and meticulously planned. I looked out at the empty road and felt a cold, jagged resolve. The burner phone rang with a restricted number that sent a chill down my spine. I answered without speaking, listening to the heavy, mechanical breathing on the other end. A voice I barely recognized told me to check the trunk of my own car. The power balance shifted as I realized David was not working alone. He was a pawn in a much larger game played by our father. Elias had planned this exit strategy for years. He was the ghost in the machine. I stepped out into the biting night air and walked toward the rear of the vehicle. My boots crunched on the gravel, the sound amplified by the concrete walls of the overpass. I popped the latch and the trunk lid hissed open. Inside lay a small, black briefcase. I reached for the handle of the case with a sense of dawning, terrible dread. Beside it lay the rag I had snatched back from the table. The metal fell ice cold. I snapped the locks open to find bundles of cash and a forged passport with my photo. This was the setup for the fall guy. I was meant to be caught at a border with the evidence of their crimes. Elias had turned his own son into a human shield to protect the family name. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the head. I looked at the passport and saw the destination was a country with no extradition. They were leaving me behind. The distant siren of a police cruiser wailed, growing louder with every passing second. I had to decide whether to run or turn back toward the wreckage of the party. The pressure escalated as a pair of headlights appeared at the far end of the road. I threw the briefcase back into the trunk and slammed the lid shut. My hands were slick with cold sweat and old grease. I scrambled back into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The headlights were closing fast. I saw the black sedan from the driveway idling, just 50 yards away in the darkness. The process server was not a lawyer. He was the cleanup crew for the bank. He flashed his lights once, a silent signal that my time had officially run out. I realized a lawsuit was a distraction to keep me pinned while the real theft happened. I put the car in gear and felt the engine roar with a desperate, metallic scream. I was being hunted by my own blood. I floored the gas and veered back onto the highway, the tires smoking against the cold pavement. The burner phone received another message with a GPS coordinate located deep in the industrial district. It was a salvage yard owned by an old friend of my father. The turn happened when I saw a second phone taped under the dashboard. It was recording my every word and movement in the car. They were documenting my flight as a confession. I was trapped in their script. I reached down and ripped the device from the wires, the plastic snapping under my grip. The silence that followed was louder than the engine's growl. I needed to reach the salvage yard before the police intercepted my signal. My father had underestimated one thing about the servant he had created. I knew every secret corner of his business because I was the one who cleaned them. I turned off the headlights and drove by the pale moonlight. The risk was absolute and final. The salvage yard gates appeared like iron teeth against the gray sky. I saw my father's car parked near a mountain of crushed steel and rusted iron. He was standing by a shipping container, checking his watch with a calm, practiced indifference. I realized he was waiting for the police to arrive and find the briefcase in my trunk. He did not see me approaching in the shadows. I reached into the glove box and found the final set of original keys, which I had grabbed from the kitchen counter before the toast. He had forgotten. I kept the master. I killed the engine and let the car coast into the deep shadows of a rusted car hauler. My objective was to intercept Elias before he signaled the police. The salvage yard smelled of stagnant oil and wet iron. I watched him through the cracked windshield, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He checked his phone again, his thumb glowing blue in the dark. I slipped the master keys into my palm, the cold steel biting my skin. The silence felt like a held breath. I stepped out of the car, moving with the quiet precision of a ghost. The pressure in my chest was a dull, rhythmic ache. Every footstep on the oil-soaked dirt felt like a thunderclap. I reached the edge of the shipping container, just as Elias turned his head. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked disappointed, as if I were a dog that had failed a simple trick. He did not know about the briefcase in my trunk. We were alone. "You were always the slow one, Joel," he said, his voice a dry whisper. He reached into his coat, but I moved faster than he expected. I slammed the shipping container door shut, the metal booming through the yard. The power balance shifted as I revealed the burner phone I had found taped under my dash. I showed him the recording of David admitting to the fraud. Elias froze, his hand stopping mid-motion. He realized the evidence had changed hands. The game was mine. I moved into his personal space, the smell of his expensive scotch clashing with the industrial rot. I did not raise my voice or offer a threat. I simply told him that the bank records were already scheduled for an automatic release. If I did not check in within 20 minutes, his entire network would collapse. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the mask slip. His eyes were wide and hollow. He was terrified of the man he had made. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own hubris. I told him I wanted the name of the man who had drained my bank account. He hesitated, looking toward the salvage yard gates. Slept. I reminded him that the police were already on their way to find a briefcase. He realized I could plant the evidence on him just as easily. The predator was finally the prey. He took a shaky breath and leaned against the cold metal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an encrypted drive. It contained the digital trail of every cent David had stolen, under his direction. Elias whispered the name of a private offshore firm I had never heard of. I took the drive and felt its heavy, metallic weight. This was my leverage and my freedom. The pressure finally began to ease from my ribs. I had the truth in my hand. But the sirens were getting much closer now. They were close. The salvage yard rattled as the first police cruiser skidded into view. I realized then that Elias had not called them to find me. He had called them to witness his own staged assault. He suddenly slammed his own face against the shipping container, blood spraying across the rusted door. He fell to the ground, crying out for help with a voice full of fake agony. I stood over him, frozen by the sheer madness of his move. He was a monster. I backed away into the maze of crushed cars, the drive tucked deep in my pocket. The blue and red lights danced across the jagged metal heaps. I heard the officers shouting orders as they vaulted over the perimeter fence. Elias pointed toward the shadows, his face a mask of crimson and lies. He claimed I had attacked him to hide my crimes. The realization hit me. I was the only one standing with a motive. I had to run. I reached my car. Just as a spotlight swept over the hauler, I scrambled into the seat and shoved the master key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a desperate, guttural rasp. I did not look at the trunk where the briefcase sat. I only looked at the gap in the rear fence I had cleared earlier. I floored it, the tires spinning in the soft mud. The spotlight followed me like a white eye. I slammed through the rusted chain link. I sped onto the back road, the wind howling through the broken fence post wedged in my bumper. I checked the rearview mirror and saw the police surrounding the salvage yard. Elias was being loaded into an ambulance, still playing the victim. I reached into the glove box to find the drive, but my hand hit something else. There was a second briefcase tucked under the seat. I opened it. It was empty, a decoy planted to ensure I kept moving. The empty briefcase was a silent mockery under the dim cabin light. I understood, then, that the digital drive was the only real currency I held. My objective shifted to a final, public reckoning before the law could close in. I steered toward a quiet hotel near the city center. The pressure in my chest remained tight like a coiled spring. I pulled into a shadow at the far end of the lot. The red dash light flickered once and died. I opened my laptop and inserted the heavy metal drive. The screen glowed with thousands of files detailing every forged document and stolen cent. My finger hovered over the send key to the local news desk. This would finish Elias and David forever. The power balance was absolute now. I could hear the distant pulse of sirens, but they were moving away. I felt a cold sense of peace. My family was finally a ghost. I hit the button. The transmission bar crawled toward completion with an agonizing slowness. I watched the percentage rise while the hotel sign buzzed overhead. The screen blinked and a live video feed opened in a small window. It showed the engagement party lawn, now a scene of blue lights and yellow tape. My mother was sitting on the porch, steps holding the greasy rag I had left behind. She was not crying. She was staring directly into the security camera lens. "You should have stayed quiet, Joel," she said through the small speakers. Her voice was steady and devoid of its usual warmth. I realized she was the one who had coordinated the theft and hidden the empty case. She had known about the plan from the very start. The realization was a sharp, physical sting. The family hierarchy had a different head than I imagined. She was the architect of my ruin. I saw the send status fail with a red error code. I tried to reboot the system, but the keyboard stayed locked. The laptop was being remotely wiped from a source I could not track. I looked out the windshield and saw a black sedan pull into the lot entrance. It was not the police or the process server. It was the caterer from the party, still wearing his white apron. He was holding a heavy wrench. He walked toward my car with a slow, deliberate stride. I was trapped. I reached for the door handle, but the locks clicked shut on their own. The car was no longer under my control. My mother's face remained on the frozen screen, her eyes cold and triumphant. I realized then that the master key I held was a digital tracker. They had let me run just to lead them to the drive. The window glass shattered inward as the wrench hit the center. I looked at the drive. It was glowing bright blue.